Welcome everybody back to another episode of the Parmenius podcast with Bernard Wills. How's it going today?
Good.
Good. Excellent. We're starting pretty much our second season, it appears, although 10 episodes or so a season is not too bad for a working professor and a student who's just a perpetual student. We're excited this time to return with a guest of some esteem in my kind of YouTube ecology and philosophy Twitter active philosophy Twitter member, Christopher Satoor. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, our pleasure.
Okay.
So I found you through your YouTube page, The Young Idealist. For anybody who's kind of interested in these German idealist topics, your videos made them kind of accessible, and your emphasis on Schelling. We wanted to get into some of the new interest in Schelling. For a long time, Schelling was kind of the subdued or the dark shadow, no pun intended, of the German idealist kind of tradition. So maybe you could just tell us in broad sweeps what brought you into an interest in Schelling, and then from there we can kind of jump into some of your broader work.
Yes, so during my undergraduate, before my undergraduate, I was at a college, community college, with a retired Kant scholar. So right away before I entered into my undergraduate, I had Kant under my belt. So was very, very interested in his critique of pure reason. And from there, when I went into my undergraduate, I was really, really intrigued by both Kant and Hegel, their texts in general. So right away, at the university I was at York University, there was a Hegel scholar named Jim Vernon, who was known in Hegel circles. So from there, I kind of got out of Hegel drew me out of German idealism, as funny as that sounds.
Mm-hmm.
And I started kind of flirting with Nietzsche and Heidegger, and slowly got out of German idealism and more interested in, Alain Badiou and Gilles Deleuze, and I was working in that area for a while. But when I started the end of my master's program, I just written my master's research paper on Deleuze. I started falling out of the whole post-structural movement. And it was my mentor, Joan Steigerwald, who I'm working with right now on my dissertation, that made me, return back to Kant and Fichte and Schelling. And this is the first time, like the first real moment where I read the Freedom Essay, and that was it. From there,
Mm-hmm.
I was done. This text was both baffling, and it was just intriguing, and it made me wanted to read it more and more and more. So from there, I became slightly obsessed with the German idealist tradition, and I wanted to know more about it. And it just so happened that COVID hit, and I started a Twitter page where I was reviewing German idealist secondary literature and posting reviews about them, but also reading, everybody in the tradition. So Kant, Reinhold, Maimon, Fichte, Schelling, everybody. And at that point, I had realized that these debates and dialogues between all of these thinkers, right, that a majority of them were, at Fichte's house and in the Schlegel's house during the kind of Romantic era, working through their own theories of the absolute, listening to Beethoven, but dialoguing constantly. So there's this kind of philosophical environment that I got really, really absorbed into, and especially Schelling's philosophies. So I became extremely excited about his work and realized that there was not a lot of work done on Schelling. I mean, there had been lots of scholarly work recently, but there were only a couple YouTube channels that had some videos on Schelling that weren't exactly very clear. And I love philosophical biographies. on thinkers, and I thought, it would be great to have a biography on Schelling's life because he has such an interesting and also tragic life. And it was an area that really needed to be discussed and brought out more to the public.
That's wonderful stuff, and especially this rich tapestry that Schelling was such a part of. It unifies all these thinkers, like the Romantic German movement, like you said, the kind of the German idealism that was like a budding field then. I guess they wouldn't have called it German idealism at the moment.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It just reminds me, though, of my earlier education, because I did classics degrees at Dalhousie University. And the man who really dominated that department was a man named James Dowell, and he was a Hegel person, and Schelling was he who should not be named. And of course, the reason was that Schelling is perceived as perhaps voluntaristic or too irrational or too mystical or whatever it was, right? But I suppose, Christopher, these are the very reasons we're interested in him now.
Yes, and this is something that I there was a kind of renaissance after World War II of Schelling. So you had people like Paul Tillich, you had Habermas, the Catholic scholar Walter Kasper, writing brilliant treatises on Schelling, especially people like Heidegger and Zizek. There was slight intrigue again in Europe, but in North America there was a huge decline in Schelling scholarship until Sean McGrath and Jason Wirth formed the North American Schelling Society, which they're pioneers in that sense. But you're right, SUNY Press had a division called Hegel Studies that people like Giovanni and Henry Harris would publish texts, and the odd text you would find, maybe a treatise on Schelling. So Peter Heath translated The System of Transcendental Idealism, and of course Michael Vader put out the Bruno text. But there was a real decline in Schelling's philosophy, and a lot of this had to do with the young Hegelians' approach and their reaction to Schelling. And Schelling's had a very negative reaction. So it's well known that when Schelling got the invite to Berlin in 1941, that he was kind of walking into a den of wolves. Friedrich Engels, Kierkegaard, Bakunin, Buchart, the Grimm brothers later on, the Humboldts, and a lot of them were very suspicious of Schelling at the time. He had been, I guess, he had kind of reverted back to his house. I mean, he was teaching still and taking, he had academic posts in the University of Munich and Erlangen, but he wasn't very active. There's the poet Heinrich Heine used to write really, begrudgingly poems about Schelling walking around Munich, his face down, looking dejected. So there was this kind of very weird and kind of negative approach to Schelling. He was seen as like you said, irrational. He was seen as just a stepping stone from Fichte onto Hegel, and Hegel was the scholar that everyone wanted to read. But
the systematizer.
Sorry. So slowly, gradually, later in the 80s, at the end of the 80s and early 90s, then you had thinkers like Andrew Bowie, who's a fantastic scholar, Bruce Matthews. A lot of thinkers started producing texts on Schelling, and he slowly started making it back out into the academic world. But even now, he's still, I still deal with, comments on Twitter once in a while from the odd Hegelian or, people that are slightly suspicious about, what's he all about?
And maybe that's a lead into the next question. What is Schelling all about?
That's a great question. And I think the best thing to say is a quote that he stated, in 1795, that philosophy is the beginning and end. Sorry, freedom is the beginning and end of all philosophy. So Schelling really is a philosophy of is a philosopher of freedom, and and even in his early phase, so his early essays, he's born in this time where there's so much fervor from the French Revolution. He's reading critically people like Christian Wolff and Herder and Goethe and Kant, and at the same time also rebelling against the theologians who were trying to make Kant's critiques compatible with a kind of theological dogmatism. And although Schelling grew up in a very pietist Lutheran religious family, a family, devoted to the Lutheran Church and pastors, etc., he wanted to make a philosophical system that both grounded freedom and also showed the capacity of human reason. Make it active, make it alive, and not just some abstract concept. But he's also, moved by people like Fichte. So he was under Fichte's wing for a while, and then got caught up in the kind of romantic conversations. And it was, his friend Holderlin that had told him, that kind of persuaded him to move away from Fichte's philosophy that nature was kind of dead in this kind of conception of the not I. And then you saw Schelling coming out of his shell in a weird way, producing this great nature philosophy, inspired by Killmeyer and Herder and even Kant's Third Critique, and giving nature reason, grounding nature as this kind of organic relational totality.
So, if I may interject briefly here, so Schelling has a kind of philosophy of nature, which is, in a certain sense, it's a spiritualization or intellectualization or rationalization or whatever of nature in terms of fundamental principles of dialectic like polarity and so on, right? And if you're a person like me, I'm grounded in a certain way in early modern and Renaissance studies and Neoplatonism and stuff like that. I mean, I think we all feel a desperate need for some better philosophy of nature than the mechanistic one we have inherited from the European Enlightenment. But at the same time, a new philosophy of nature has to interface in some way, say, with what my colleagues over in biology are doing, because, they work under certain paradigms and they, have to produce papers and research and so on and so forth, right? Can Schelling help us with this problem today?
Yes. So what I think Schelling allows us to do is break away from, and I really mean this, I really think that a majority of us are still stuck as Cartesians when we think of the subject-object binary, or the way that we look at nature as some, sorry about the phone there, some kind of homogeneous whole that's compartmentalized as just objects, as dead products or something. And Schelling has a kind of an organic conception of nature. Nature as not just that word. It's not just, the ground of human beings, but nature is this kind of relational totality. It has these potencies and intensities. Each product of nature is the infinite in finite form. And I think his philosophy allows us to rethink the conception of what nature is. Nature is not this Cartesian mechanized project of a broken down into its constituent, this kind of mechanistic philosophy that spawned from Enlightenment philosophy, especially from Descartes, who saw the world as this kind of mechanized machine. And as Kenguihem, great kind of French rational vitalist, stated that in the Enlightenment we tend to see everything as this invented object. And so we would do that, that kind of objectifying gaze to nature. Nature became this machine that we could break down. And Schelling just thought, no, this is not the case. Nature is, the products of nature are, the infinite written in finite form, and that there were these intensities below each substance, each product in a sense. He would actually call entities in nature actants. They were kind of like these living monads in a Leibnizian sense.
And they're acting out a process that is dialectical and rational, right? But I assume that it requires a philosophical investigation rather than a scientific investigation per se to uncover that.
Yes. So what Schelling will say is that yes, nature is still working through what he calls an atomism, but what we have to add to it is a dynamic atomism. So he has an approach called speculative physics that attempts to approach nature, see how nature emerges. It emerges out of what he calls this unconditioned. Nature is this, mode of absolute productivity. And each living entity is a product of that cycle of productivity. So if you imagine, a seed that drops from a tree, it's got that living DNA from that tree, but it's also individuated. So in this sense, what he says is, when this productivity, this absolute productivity from nature is inhibited, and there's always this process that you'll find also later on in his later work, that there's this kind of contraction and expansion always going on. And he's pulling this theory from a medical philosopher, a medical theorist named John Brown, who had this theory of contraction and expansion. And so when nature is inhibited, this absolute productivity is inhibited, kind of like a stream. When a stream is going around bends, what happens is it's inhibited, its action is inhibited, and little tiny whirlpools are formed from this inhibition. And he calls those whirlpools, those actants. That's how products are formed out of this absolute productivity.
Interesting. So back to this kind of the distinction between, say, us humanities on the humanities side of the campus and the biology. It seems to me that biology's fine and good at designating all kinds of particularities and talking about their universality, but what Schelling seems to be doing is trying to speak of the universal and to tie that in with all the things that we see that are philosophical questions. Like, for example, and if we could just go to his notion of freedom, this notion that you said, Christopher, about actants, this is so baked into the cake of what Schelling thinks with regard to freedom as the cut between good and evil, seems to me. So, in a way, Schelling's freedom philosophy is not so distinct, but it's amazing the quote you started with seemed to be about 10 years before the famous freedom essay came out.
Yes.
Is that's correct?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
This idea that philosophy, that freedom is the beginning and the end of all philosophy, or sometimes he'll say that freedom is the alpha and the omega of all philosophy. Like, he has these two brilliant quotes in regards to freedom and the conception of freedom. And what he's doing in that nature philosophy is extending freedom to nature, extending reason to nature. Nature is not a substance-based ontology. It's a relational ontology in a sense. When wind blows through a tree, you're seeing two actants being affected by, in this specific situation or an event. But you're right about freedom, and the reason why he moves to this conception of freedom is because in Germany at the time there was a massive debate going on about pantheism, and it started because of Lessing. Lessing and Mendelssohn, two brilliant philosophers, were kind of arguing over the intrigue of Spinoza's ethics. So Spinoza's ethics became this kind of grandiose model both ontology and cosmology and metaphysics in Germany. And a lot of philosophers were quite skeptical of, even the name Spinoza send, shudders to people, philosophers at the time. It meant atheism, it meant a lot of things. But from 1796, Schelling had written a letter to Hegel stating that, he had found a new teacher, and that teacher was Spinoza. So Spinoza has always been quite close with Schelling. However, during this age of him writing the Freedom Essay, what he does is he redefines the conception of pantheism. So he finds that Spinoza is not a pantheist but a fatalist, and that we have to rethink this model of pantheism, and we have to rethink our understanding of freedom, and a kind of a radical form of freedom.
From my reading of that passage, Chris, I mean, I take it his basic point is that the kind of geometrical rationalism of Spinoza's ethics is not an adequate account of the nature of a first principle, right, which has to be in some sense self-positing or self-grounding or free. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right about that. In the first proposition of Spinoza's ethics, God is that which is through itself and in itself. So God is always this, causa sui, it's self-acting. However, everything else, modes, so we would be modes, are these modifications of substance, and yet it's always determined by two attributes, thought and extension, but never freely acting. It can strive. Spinoza allots the concept of conatus, a striving, but there is no radical freedom there at play. That's grounding each mode or being.
Yeah. And then one might legitimately wonder, if you're a critic of Spinoza, how is it that this kind of self-grounding, self-positing, absolutely free principle cannot give rise to freedom, right? How does it give rise to, just pure necessity? I mean, in a sense, it couldn't, could it?
I think what he'll say is no, because, there's this brilliant line where he says, that the end result is that even the will is a thing for Spinoza. And he has this wonderful, he calls Spinoza's system a Pygmalion statue that's been drained of the warm breath of spirit in this weird sense. And what he wants to do is kind of spiritualize Spinoza. So, the kind of predicates that he uses in the Freedom Essay, ground in existence, they take over Spinoza's naturan naturans and natura naturata. So they become this split in the essence of God. And so there's one more thing that we should, if we're going to merge into the Freedom Essay, I should state that at the time between 1805 and 1807, Schelling, was at the time living in Bavaria, and under the guise of Franz von Baader, a Catholic philosopher, but also theosopher. And it was through Baader that Schelling began reading thinkers like Christoph Friedrich Oerdinger and, of course, Jakob Böhme. So Jakob Böhme is a huge influence on the Freedom Essay. It is, Schopenhauer, in a funny way, stated, there's nothing original in the Freedom Essay. It's just Schelling copying Böhme, which is funny. But in a sense, it is Schelling taking theosophical concepts and making them into hard philosophical living concepts. So he takes Böhme's Ungrund, and he takes the whole theosophy, the whole kind of spiritual play, and he links it to Plato's Timaeus of this this demiurge, kind of like a surfer surfing through waves and bringing together the creation of the cosmos. And he does this so beautifully that he shows that, look, even God is overcoming obstacles. God is not this thing out there, this abstract thing that is, all-knowing and is this abstract conception or a concept or an idea, but is a living totality that is also overcoming obstacles, also suffering. So
And yeah, sorry.
No, go on.
Ahead.
Sorry.
Sorry. No. And this brings me to my next question, I suppose, which is, oh, sorry. So when you're speaking about freedom, okay, well, the archetypal conception or the very paradigm of divine freedom, of freedom is divine freedom, right? So, I mean, what you say about freedom and what you say about freedom in God are kind of, one and the same in a certain sense. And in Schelling, there seems to be this conception of, I guess you would call a kind of light-dark polarity in God, or that the divine life is, in a sense, some kind of synthesis of a deep and profound opposition.
Yes. So
yes.
This is why, when people sit down and read the freedom essay, they're scratching their head for a while. Because essentially, what Schelling is showing is that in this beginning process, the emergence of life, God, in a sense, splits his essence into two, and what holds the two together is the ungrund, the groundless ground. But also, if we were to say that God necessarily had to create the world in the sense of this is the best of all possible worlds, like Leibniz, what we end up doing is limit God's freedom by saying he necessarily had to create this world. So Schelling's whole point is that's not the case. When we're talking about radical freedom, we can't limit an agent. And the same thing happens with this kind of robust feeling of, or so that this robust conception of freedom that he has in mind. And this is why he starts off talking about freedom in a weird, in the most kind of abstract sense. So he'll say something like, look, think of your body as one totality, one whole. However, your eye can contract an illness. It can get pink eye. And that ability, the fact that your mouth or your tongue can't get it, but your eye can get it, is this power of freedom. So what he wants to show is that there is no negative or positive aspect of freedom. This radical element of freedom is this ability, this kind of the way that you can contract that illness for that eye. So, and its own kind of individual specific freedom.
Yeah. So there's a kind of ocular freedom, if you want.
Yes.
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 And that ocular freedom, I mean, I think the image of evil or illness there is an interesting one, because of course, when the eye is most itself, right? Like the eye is most itself, it's like Heidegger's hammer, right? When the eye is ill, right? That's where it stands forth in a way from the whole. And of course, if you go back to Plotinus, who I'm guessing you're going to tell us that Schelling read a lot of Plotinus, right? He did. One of the ways, Plotinus has a number of ways of speaking about how the nous, the second principle, emerges from the one, and one of them is, he says, hubris and daring, or even sin, right? That the initial moment of that freedom of the second principle, the nous from its ground, is in a certain sense a moment of evil. It doesn't end up that way, but in a certain sense in its beginning, right? And does Schelling draw a kind of relationship that way?
So this has been argued amongst scholars for a while.
Okay.
I would say the wonderful treatise Philosophy and Religion in 1804 is very influenced by Plotinus. And this is his kind of biggest stage of where he's really flirting with Plotinus's Neoplatonism, and the fall too. So in that text, there's a fall away from the infinite or the absolute. And what happens is that because nous becomes entangled with necessity or the material world, in itself is less absolute. And so there's a real distinction between the finite and the infinite. But the freedom essay is where he's kind of staunchly against this kind of Platonian thinking. And so for him, he moves closer to Burma and away from Plotinus. So evil. So I'll give you an example.
Okay.
The beginning. So when you're reading the freedom essay, I always tell my students and anyone that are watching my videos that the freedom essay really begins on page 27, where if you're using the Sunni edition, where he states, hold on, let me just grab it. Sorry for the pause. Where he says, since nothing is prior to or outside of God, he must have the ground of his existence in himself. So this element where he starts talking about, the dynamics of his both of the cosmogony that he's going to bring about, but then when he starts talking about this ground, right? So there's this ground in God that is nature in God, and it's both part of God, but also not a part, but that is also not God. So it's co-eternal. So it's this dark ground that's yearning to be like the absolute, and yet different and individuated and distinct. But that ground, he'll say, is always longing to be something else. So this is where humanity is born. Humanity is born in this ground, and without the logos, without the actual theological logos added to the ground, it's this self-dark egoity, this constant craving. So evil, in a sense, is, for Schelling at this time, separated from the logos, is this craving, this egoity, this kind of selfish drive. And you can see why someone like Zizek likes this dynamic with his kind of psychoanalytic reading. So until the logos or the kind of the mythos of Christianity is added to this ground, without the kind of historical spirit, the ground, there is no universal ground to help center the human, right? He brings up this beautiful example of being having its own center, and driven in the center is this element of our own personality. But at sometimes we're seduced, we're solicited by this ground that makes us move towards the periphery and allows us to be seduced by the material world, by things around us, and we subordinate the so-called self-will of this dark ground, under the universal ground. And this is where evil happens. Evil is this seduction to our own selves, our own kind of gritty fascination with longing and yearning and desiring more and more and more.
Sorry. So can I ask a question in relation to Hegel here? Because at least in my reading of Hegel, when spirit posits itself as, in some sense, the finite within the infinite, there is a moment of negation or opposition in that, and in our experience that appears in a kind of way as finite evil or suffering, and which even God himself undergoes. Is evil a kind of necessity in Schelling?
Really good question. So, I like your reading of Hegel too. I think what Schelling is trying to do is maintain the opposition always, maintain the contradiction. So he's in this phase, so you can see the freedom essay as a staunch answer to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. But evil and goodness are the same, are like heads and tails on a coin. So you can't have one without the other, in a sense. They're connected. They're necessarily connected, like predicates, like a bond between them. And what Schelling is trying to advocate here is that evil also has a positive side. And this is where people go, what? And this is the whole element. This is the defining ground of personality. So Schelling won't use the term subjectivity. He really likes this idea of personality. And what happens is personality is born out of this darkness. It is born out of evil. Not in the sense of the biblical fall. I mean, he will cite the biblical fall.
Fall, sure.
But it essentially is coming from this moment of where we're always driven into ourselves. We're driven into this pure egoity and this longing. There's always this kind of eternal longing, this separation. But that has to occur. That has to be there. And so evil isn't, evil and goodness, like your two left hands, your left, so you're like your two left and right hands. Yes. Yeah. They're identical, but in different spatial locations. And so they're a part of us. You're always in the face of this moment, always there.
Yeah. So help me, because I'm sort of thinking about it this way, right?
By the way, I apologize if I'm not being clear. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're being crystal clear.
It's a very dense text, so no worries.
So evil in us has this moment of, as you put it, pure egoity?
Yep.
Okay, all right. But of course, if I speak in terms of moral evil, okay, that's where that egoity seeks to dominate another egoity. So you have Adam and Eve after the fall, right? And one of them's got to subdue the other in a certain sense, okay? So what does Schelling say specifically about moral evil?
So this is where a lot of theological scholars visit this text, because there's this beautiful line towards the end of the Freedom Essay, around page 50, where Schelling begins talking about Judas and what you're talking about.
Okay, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What is sin? What is this moral evil? And he says it comes down to and it's going to sound weird, but it comes from our character. So Judas wasn't a sinner because he sold Christ for 30 pieces of silver. It's he chose this. He chose this moment of character, this moment of personality, this moment where, as Schelling says, we become the reverse God, where we subordinate the universal ground, right? Which is the true history or the true spirit of the Logos, for this self-egoity, this self-will.
Yeah. And there's a beautiful image of that in the New Testament, because, of course, Judas throws the silver away, right? I mean, it doesn't, like, the silver doesn't mean anything to him.
Right.
Yeah,
no. So this is that moment. And it's so funny. He says that we create this character in eternity. I love this line. And it kind of baffles a lot of people, but it's weirdly true. When we change as individuals, we don't notice that change. Our friends and family notice a change in ourselves. And so when this happens, when we're in a sense solicited by this self-ground, by the self-will of the dark ground, where we're pulled away, and we're being, we're in a sense always overcoming these obstacles. We never really realize this. And Schelling is saying, no, this is a living ground that we're talking about, and it's a conflict. We're never always like, this is not, in a sense, Leibniz's theosophy where good conquers evil. This is an ongoing struggle that we never can get at. It's always, going in this cycle.
Well, even Kant says in Religion Within the Limits of Pure Reason that, in a sense, the moral project is infinite, because my external actions, my attitudes, my opinions, my passions, whatever, right, can never fully be conformed to the good maxim of my will. except projectively forward in a certain sense.
Yes.
Right? Would Schelling agree with that?
Yeah, and I think he would, absolutely. It's so interesting that you bring that up, because he almost, he cites, in the margins examples of Kant from Religion Within the Bounds of Reason. I think that's the name of the text. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that text in itself is extremely important for Schelling, and this example of personality and sin, of evil, etc.
Does he accept Kant's notion of radical evil?
I think he's trying. Okay, so in a sense, he's trying to formulate his own notion, but at the same time, he wants to show that, like, I think his frustration with Kant is that when we think of evil as negative, as not a privation, but it's something adverse to the good. Schelling wants to show, and this is what I think makes this text pivotal and important, is that they're kind of, in a weird way, they're kind of linked, good and evil. They're linked like, two sides of a coin that form a whole, and that we can never really get away from it. So I don't know if I really answered your question there, so I feel bad. But
well, no, I mean, I don't know if there is an answer, but okay. So we are coming up on 46 minutes. So we got about.
Sure.
Okay.
So if I could just ask Christopher, so that link is precisely what we're talking about with regard to the will, right? So I know one of the difficulties that you illuminated in your video was this language in the Sunni version, which I have right here. If you can hear me flipping through while we're discussing here, the philosophical investigations of the essence of human freedom. The notion of ground is a difficulty in translation in this text, but we're talking about the will as it's kind of coextensive with this notion of ground for God and for us, and this is related to this duality, or this, I think you didn't say polarity, but it was mentioned earlier, of this good and evil as being bonded. So is this the difficulty in thinking in terms of the will and Schelling's particular conception of the will?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I should have said this earlier. Very close before Schelling even gets into the kind of the dynamic of the ground and existence and this whole kind of, when he's talking about essence, he says in German, Sein ist Wollen, like, primordial being is will. So right there. So he makes this really fundamental. This is why, Heidegger thinks this text is beyond idealism, that it's an ontology. He likes this idea that ground and existence give us this connectivity, the jointure of the being of beings, in a sense. So he loves this idea that we're moving past consciousness, we're moving past self-consciousness, and we're talking now about primordial being. We're talking ontologically.
Incredible.
Yeah. Okay. We had a breakup there.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
I'll cut that perfectly fine. I'm very interested. So Heidegger's treatment of this text is, he also considers it to be one of the most important philosophical texts, which is an incredible thing for Heidegger to have said. So what is this ontological reading of this kind of conception of will in Schelling?
So Heidegger's reading of Schelling is phenomenal. So if anybody that's listening gets a chance to read Heidegger's reading of the treatise from I think it's 36 to 38, it's phenomenal. And he's onto something. And I'll also bring up one of the criticisms that Heidegger has with the text as well, too. But Heidegger brings us to this notion that Schelling's, kind of spiritualization of Spinoza, going past natura naturans, natura naturata, using this double essence, this ground in existence. What he's essentially showing is that we're talking about the jointure of the being of beings, even this idea that primordial being is will. And he loves this idea. He loves the fact that we're no longer trying to ground the human being in self-consciousness. we're moving past that. We're now talking fundamentally about our own being. When Heidegger talks about who are the entities that we're investigating, we are those entities. That moment when Schelling brings up this whole dynamic, and freedom isn't just some attribute. Freedom is a property, Heidegger says, of the human being. So essentially, this fundamental proposition about primordial being will is something that attracts Heidegger to this treatise, because we're no longer talking about self-consciousness, or we're no, that's the so-called understanding of the human being. We're now talking about will. We're talking in terms of ontology. And when Schelling brings up the predicates of ground and existence, Heidegger allots this to the jointure of the being of beings, which is pretty important, and that freedom is not some attribute or predicate. Freedom is a property of Dasein, or of the human being. And this is what he gets from this text. But Heidegger also says that, something odd about the end of the freedom essay is what rubs him the wrong way. So he says Schelling has this brilliant ontology, but in the end collapses into ontotheology. Like the whole dynamic at the end of the kind of coming of Christ and this Christ event, and love conquering over spirit. He thinks that Schelling kind of resurrects it in itself and collapses into ontotheology. And that's what he has. He has a kind of problem with the end of the text, Heidegger.
Yeah. So in our remaining minutes, I don't know, there's a number of things I'd like to discuss here, but maybe we only have time for one. Now, I found out on Twitter, Chris, that you're of Armenian heritage.
Yes, I am, yeah.
Yes. And so perhaps, when I hear Schelling, you expound Schelling, I am reminded of, a tradition, an area of thought of which I am woefully ignorant, but nonetheless interested in. And that is, philosophy and theology in Eastern Orthodoxy. And, I'm specifically thinking of somebody like Berdyaev, or somebody like Zizoulis, or somebody, in that kind of tradition. Could you comment on, the role, if any, that Schelling plays in, Eastern Orthodox thought? If you can. I mean, I don't know, right?
No, that's a really, really great question. It's so funny, around the middle era, like around the 1830s, Schelling was in a kind of controversy where a lot of his friends, because he had been, around Catholic Bavaria, were accusing him of converting to Catholicism, and this was not the case. Through letters to his brother, he remained a staunch Protestant. But in the philosophy of revelation, Schelling goes out of his way to, in a sense, reread the followers of Byzantium. So you see him you see a profound influence from people like Pseudo-Dionysius, Origen, Gregory of Nyssa. So him moving slowly away from that Catholic tradition. Unfortunately, I don't know much about the Russian Schellingians. I really should, so I have to apologize for that. But I would just say that this later Schelling is much more interested in this tradition of theology, and from Origen onward, let's say, to past Gregory of Nyssa, up to Pseudo-Dionysius.
Sure. Yeah.
But he's also still influenced by people like Meister Eckhart. So when he says things like, when he's talking about being the Lord of being, or being beyond being, Übersein, he's really talking about, Meister Eckhart. He gets closer to Eckhart towards the end. Unfortunately, I'm a little, I don't have much knowledge on the Orthodox tradition, philosophically speaking or theologically
Sure.
speaking,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is unfortunate. But I've been trying to grapple with the Protestant tradition because I went to Catholic high schools and Catholic schools,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
also, raised an Orthodox, Christian, and then having, dealing with that tradition, and then going back and reading people like, of course, Luther, and then Angelus Silesius and Jakob Böhme and Erdinger and all of
Mm-hmm.
these Protestant
Mm-hmm.
thinkers,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to grapple with this lineage that Schelling is working with.
Yeah. Yeah. See, I'm just curious because, like, if you asked me, is there an Armenian philosophical tradition and what does it consist in? I'm afraid I wouldn't know, but I'm sure there's such a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I know Bartholomew and Thaddeus took Christianity to
Yeah.
Armenia in 301
Yeah.
AD,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that there is a strong connection. Armenians have a very strong connection with Christianity. We can, even apostolic Christianity, we consider
Mm-hmm.
the Christianity of Armenia coming from the apostles. So this is something that we hold on to. And when we talk about communities, our communities are always centered around the church. There's this great
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
great quote by William Saranian that states that wherever you find a community, if you ever meet an Armenian, you'll find their community and their church. It's kind of an interesting thing that goes along with our kind of heritage.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's just so much to get into in all of these questions, and so much of your own work, Christopher. And we appreciate your time. We're coming up on the hour now, and I guess I'd just like to say thanks so much for your time and this really rich discussion on all these kind of questions in Schelling. And there's almost an endless number of questions within this one text, so I can only imagine Schelling's other texts are equally fascinating. But kind of moving from Schelling, can you tell us, are there any projects in the works for the YouTube page, any other things, any publications we can kind of put out there as a kind of promotion to our listeners who are probably equally interested in checking out Schelling and your page?
Well, I'm currently writing an article for the Bloomsbury Encyclopedia to Visual Art, and they'd asked me to talk about both Kant and Schelling's philosophy of art because, of course, Kant's aesthetics, but Schelling has a philosophy of art that's very, very intrinsically close to nature and not aesthetics. So I'm writing that currently. Wow. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Schelling really touched it all, didn't he?
He really did.
Yeah.
He really did. And other than that, I'm working to complete my dissertation, which should be done in May. And then from there, I'll keep producing, keep putting out these videos on other issues. So if there's anything that you'd like me to make a video on YouTube, I'll do a video if you'd like.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So many fascinating questions
Yeah.
here, and I really appreciate your time. And I'm going to keep following your page. It's been very helpful for my understanding of German idealism as kind of a beginner reader.
Sure.
So I guess from the Parmenius podcast, thank you, Christopher, and we hope to talk to you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was immensely informative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.